Hi everyone, and welcome to Speaking SharePoint's Language using the HTTP to SharePoint actions in Power Automate. I'm Ashley Rogers, and I'm super excited to be here with you today. For anyone who's going to be using social media to post about the summit, please go ahead and use the hashtag that's on the side there. It's hashtag Scottish Summit 2021. Share all your experiences and feedback, all the excitement. I'd love to see pictures of folks who are actually watching the sessions as they go on. So go ahead and use that hashtag. We have a lot of great things for you today. I can't wait to jump in and help you guys learn about using HTTP against SharePoint.
Okay, first, before we get started, thank you so much to all of our sponsors. Right here are great folks who are helping us make this possible. Remember that even though we are not in person, a virtual event takes so much to put together. So the sponsors and the volunteers, everybody who works to put this all together, thank you so much. So quick shout out to these guys. First, we have Script Runner, the #1 for PowerShell management. Love PowerShell. And we have DQ Global, driving data quality, Proximo 3, Microsoft Consulting Specialists, and then Redspire, Agilysys, and Hitachi Solutions. Thank you guys so much for making this possible for us. All right, so next, let me tell you a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Ashley Rogers. I am the Business Productivity Lead at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. This has been a great role for me because it really combines my deep SharePoint knowledge with the Power Platform automations that I love. So every day I get to help people to create better, more efficient processes in their day-to-day life. I'm a Microsoft MVP focused on biz apps, even though SharePoint was really my first love. It's something I've been doing for over 10 years at this point, and I continue to enjoy every day. I do speaking and blogging. If you want to check out my blog, it's ravendev.net. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is @AshRogers.
Today we're going to be looking at the SharePoint connector and more specifically the HTTP to SharePoint action. We're going to be going from general to specific, looking at the verbs for HTTP and what they mean, and then using them in context inside of SharePoint. I'll be showing you some demos inside of Power Automate, as well as some theory and some tips and tricks that you can use to make better calls. There are more than 10 triggers and more than 40 actions inside the SharePoint connector. This is great because they are always working on this specific connector, and there's a lot of support here for different use cases. So not only can you go ahead and get items, but you can also do some interesting things with those that were previously only HTTP or PowerShell supported actions. So what I mean by this is many things that used to just be something you could do only with PowerShell or only in maybe the admin center, the SharePoint admin center, or that you could only do by using the HTTP to SharePoint action. A lot of those things are now being created as out-of-the-box actions. So when you're going through and looking inside Power Automate to see if there's support for what you're trying to do, make sure you look through all of the actions and also take a peek at the documentation. I'll link the documentation at the end of the presentation so that you can have access to that. But remember, you can also go into the connector section in Power Automate and find a link there. There are a lot of templates to use as well, so there's a lot of support here to get you started with things that maybe you didn't think that you could do. Now, if you need a little bit more power, the HTTP to SharePoint action is where you're going to find that. Do remember that this requires appropriate permissions to all resources, just like anything else that you're trying to access inside of Office 365. So for instance, if you don't have access to a particular resource, you're not going to be able to get into that. And there might be cases where you're actually going to need admin permissions or an admin account to go ahead and get something done. If you do invite people to use a flow that you create, you're going to need to make sure that that person also has appropriate permissions. They can't go ahead and run this as you. So you're going to want to make sure that everybody down the line who is using this has access to all the resources and has the ability to actually perform the actions that are necessary to get the workflow done. Otherwise, you're going to have some troubleshooting on your hands. So let's talk specifically about HTTP to SharePoint. There are a couple of considerations here of why we would use this. And the first, and I think most important, is that it is the only standard HTTP connector available inside of Power Automate. There is a general HTTP connector. This is something that has actions where you can go ahead and use HTTP verbs. But if you're familiar with that, you'll know that that is actually a premium connector. There is a premium license cost associated with that. There will be times where this is appropriate to use, especially if you need to do something like hit Microsoft Graph, or you need to go ahead and hit resources that are outside of Office 365. It has a lot of flexibility, but there's a good amount of ramp up to using it if you're not familiar with it. But in general, this is something that is premium. And if that is a non-starter for you, either based on cost or accessibility because the business won't be able to grant you that license in time or something like that, if this is a non-starter for you, you can go ahead and look into the SharePoint HTTP, because that is something that comes as part of your regular license for Power Automate. So it is standard, it is something that you can use, and maybe SharePoint isn't the most appropriate data source for your specific use case, but when it comes to a cost consideration, there's a lot you're actually going to get. So I would go ahead and investigate SharePoint as an option for you. If you are coming to this from a SharePoint development or a web development background, this is going to be a familiar pattern to you. The places that you put this are going to look different because we're working inside of Power Automate actions, but the pattern of how we actually make those calls and how that's constructed behind the scenes is going to be very familiar, especially if you've already been working specifically with SharePoint's RESTful endpoint. So this means that you already have the knowledge that you need in order to get things done in an efficient manner, in a familiar manner, but maybe it's just the tool that you need an introduction to. So let's talk about HTTP methods. There are more than just the 4 here on the screen, but these are the ones that we are going to be talking about today. And this is because they're the most common. These are the ones that have the least amount of subtlety when you're trying to work with them, and they're the easiest to understand. So let's go through these and talk about each of them, and then we're going to go ahead and see what each of them can do. The first here is the GET method. So GET is when I'm going to make a request from resources for something back. So this is maybe a list, this is maybe the items in that list, or information about documents inside of a document library in SharePoint. But in any case, I'm getting something back from the request that I'm making, and that's what I'm looking for as a read. The POST method is to create something. So this is when I'm writing back to a list and I am actually creating an item there. I'm going to need to supply all the required fields when I make my POST request, and it's really just all about creation. Patch starts to get a little tricky because this is where I'm updating an existing item. So this is something that is already out there. I already have the ID of it, and I'd like to make a change to one of the fields or one or more of the fields that are part of that specific item. There are some gotchas when working with patch, but we will definitely look over those. So finally, there is delete. There are some cases where you're going to want to work with delete, but many times I find that you need to be very careful about making this available as part of a flow that multiple people will use. We want to make sure that there aren't any errors. We want to make sure that we very much test all the different cases around using delete. Otherwise, you can end up removing items that you do want, right? So we want to make sure that there's a backup and recovery story along with the resources that you're using, and that you're only really deleting things that you know you have the ID for, that you're being very careful with. So again, there can be use cases where you want to use this, but when you do sort of like batch updates, it's really something that you want to stay away from. Okay, so let's go ahead and open Power Automate and take a peek at the SharePoint connector and the HTTP to SharePoint action. So let's create something. Let's go to My Flows. And let's do New Flow. And I'm going to go ahead and say instant Cloudflow. This is what I use when I'm doing testing, or if I need to do something that's not actually automated. It's something that I would like to run ad hoc when I want to. So let's click that. And then right up at the top here, I'm going to choose my trigger, which is manually trigger a flow. And I'm going to say get items, HTTP. Okay, so what we have in here is we have our trigger, and we're going to manually trigger this. This is not going to run automated or anything like that. We do need a second step in order to save this. So let's go ahead and type in SharePoint. It's going to pop up here. And then I'm going to see all of the actions. It does list all the triggers, but because we already have a manual trigger, we don't need to look at that. So the actions. So taking a look at the actions that are available, we have things here that I was maybe 18 months ago doing using HTTP to SharePoint. Specifically, I'd like to call out this check-in and check-out file. I was doing that with HTTP calls, and now those are out-of-the-box actions. That is awesome. It is very exciting. So anytime that you know that there's something you'd like to do that you've done previously with HTTP, or you're not sure is out of the box, come take a look at the documentation. It might be there, and it's going to save you time. Now, if you want to do more with it, and you actually do need your HTTP, that's where this action comes in handy. So all I did to get to this was just typed in HTTP in the search bar, and it brought this down and filtered everything else out. So I'm going to do my send an HTTP request to SharePoint. So this is where you're going to go ahead and define your call. And behind the scenes, this is making a call to the RESTful endpoint in SharePoint. This is just building for you the call that you might be familiar with as you have already written code against SharePoint's RESTful endpoint, and it's easy to get started with as long as you understand a few keywords here. So the site address is pretty easy to understand. This is just the name of the site as it shows up in the URL. So I'm going to drop this down and pick my Terraflora, and this is the entire URL, right? So we've got the whole HTTPS, the / and then Terraflora. The method we're going to be using just for this example is get. And the URI is where this comes in a little bit tricky. It gives you an example, but you may not understand what this means. And basically you can think of the URI as just the rest of the URL if this is something that you're not really familiar with. So all we're trying to do is build out the URL that shows up whenever I go to a list, for instance, or I go to a library. But the special part about this is we have this section that says _API /web /lists /get by title. So it looks a lot like when we're building out that URL that is in the browser when we access a resource visually, when we go in there via the browser and looking at the UI. It's just structured differently and has a few different components to it, but it's basically the same thing. Headers are anything we're passing in to help get us metadata, and we'll look at an example in a moment there. And the body is really going to come in key when we're talking about post and patch. This is going to help us send metadata back and forth. Okay, so to support our little get that we're doing here for HTTP, I have a movie list here, and this is just things that I found online. I just did a search for a couple of different fantasy movies, a couple of different horror movies, and what we're going to be doing today is building out this list and changing this. So a couple of really classics here like Psycho and Princess Bride, Highlander, all that good stuff. And all I'm trying to do is make a request to get this list, and I want to see back in Power Automate these choices. So let's go back over here to where we were creating our flow. And here we're pretty set up already, but what I need to do is put in that list title. So we've got our site address. I know it's the Terraflora. I know that I'm using the get method. And in my URI, what I'm going to be doing is typing this out, right? So we're going to do /API /web /lists /get by title. And then in parentheses, I'm going to go ahead and put movies, because that is the name of my list. And then I'm going to go ahead and do items with a question mark. This might seem a little funny to you, but this is basically how we're talking about getting all of the items. If I was just to go ahead and get the list, I wouldn't be asking for the items, but I'd like to see all of the items coming back to me. So in addition to this, I need to put in some headers. So I'm going to say except. And then this one's where it gets a little tricky. So what I'm looking for is I'm looking for this to come back in JSON. And then I'm going to say OData equals no metadata. What this is going to do is give me a really clean list of items that comes back. And let's take a peek at what that looks like. So I'm going to save this. Cool. Thanks, Flo, for recommending that I test it. That's very nice. Let's go ahead and test it. And then I'm going to say manually, right? So since it's a manually triggered flow, we're going to go ahead and click test. Let's see what we get back. So we're good to go. We're going to continue and then run. Those are little extra bits that you get when you first do a flow, when it's the first time you're running it. Cool. So it ran successfully, which is always great. We get our little green check marks telling me each stage has completed successfully. And let's take a peek. We're going to open this up and look at what comes back from the send an HTTP request to SharePoint here. If I had a ton of items that came back to me, the body may actually have a hyperlink instead of all of this printed out. If it has a hyperlink, not to worry. All the items are there. They've all come back to you. You just click on that hyperlink and it's going to open it inside the browser. Sometimes it's messy, so you might want to copy and paste what comes back from the body, if there's a ton of it, into something like Visual Studio Code, so you can actually parse through it and make sense of it a little bit easier in a tool. And Visual Studio Code is free, so I recommend grabbing that. But in any case, for us, my information came back inside the body here, and it's pretty easy to go ahead and look at. So I have inside the body, this is all JSON, it's coming back, I have my values, and then I can see things that are key to me here, right? So like ID and things, we have our content type ID, I have the title of the first movie that came back, which was Labyrinth. I've got all my different metadata about this, and it's very clean. It's coming back very easy, right? I didn't have anybody in the person section there, and it does have a related related data. I do have another list called genre, and what I'm doing is associating the two. So this does have an ID here related to that genre list, and that is 1. So I can see all the different items here. You can see that they are by item. They're sectioned out here. This is how it comes back as JSON. And this is just a great way to start working with the information that's coming back. So cool, I got back what I expected, nice and clean, looks great. So let's come back over to the slides real quick. We just did our get items, our very first example of how to structure an HTTP call inside of Power Automate. Let's go over what we looked at, because if you hadn't seen this before, it can feel like a bit of a fire hose. I break this down for you so that you can always remember how to structure these calls when you're putting together that URI. So the URL structure that we care about inside of our calls is the SharePoint site address, which is our tenant name.sharepoint.com. And then we do a /. And anytime that you have a site address that has more to it, if for instance you're working with subsites and there's a longer site address, you want to include everything there. So this is going to be your tenant.sharepoint.com, and then it's going to be /sites / the name of the site. All of that's going in the SharePoint site address section because that's what we're referencing. The second bit here is the reference to the REST API. This is telling SharePoint, hey, I'm hitting the RESTful endpoint, and this is the _API /web / that's the section. The part that's much more variable and that you're going to learn to build up is the place where we're indicating our list name and asking for items. So here we're doing lists /get by title, and then the list name /items. So this is just a section that's telling me to get back the items, but this ending section is actually where you're going to build out the rest of the interesting things you can do. We can select only particular fields, we can expand the request, this is where we put in an item ID, all that good stuff is going to be here inside the URL structure. So all that's fine, that's great, we know how to get items, but let's do something more interesting, right? So before we actually create items, we're going to need to understand a concept called key value pairs. Again, if you've seen this kind of thing, this is going to be a snooze for you, but if you haven't, this can be a little bit tricky. So using key value pairs is how we indicate a field and the data that's inside that field for a particular item. So for instance, in this example, my key is title. That's the field name. So I'm referencing a specific column inside the list called title. And the field value is the value, right? So key value. The field value is going to be different potentially per item. So the field name title, the field value is my new item 1. And it's going to be structured like this, where when we're referencing this and we're creating items and we're defining metadata, and even when we're updating metadata using a patch method, it's going to end up looking something like this, where we have these double quotes around the field name, double quotes around the field value, and they're separated by a colon there. Everything that we pass in is going to look like JSON, so familiarize yourself with what that looks like. As you start to use it, there's going to be patterns that you can use for yourself and repeatable ways that you can work with the data. Okay, let's go into an HTTP post example and go ahead and create some items. So here we are back inside of Power Automate, and I've made some updates to the flow we were working on to make it reflect a post method. So this is something that we're going to create. So going over what we're doing here, we're still working with our movies list, and we're looking at creating an item inside of that. So if we go over to SharePoint, we can see that there are currently 6 items in here, the last one being The Conjuring, the last ID being number 6. And in here, what I'd like to do is add Wonder Woman. So what I've done is verify my site address. That's not changing since my GET request. I'm changing the method to post. I did that by just simply using the dropdown and choosing post. My URI is staying the same. We're still talking about the items inside the movies list. And my headers also stayed the same. We're still doing a nice except application JSON OData equals no metadata here. The only real difference other than the method is the fact that we're now making use of the body section here. What I've done is written just a little bit of JSON that looks exactly like the example of the key value pairs that we were working with in the slides. I have my title, which is my key, and that's inside of double quotes, a colon, and then the value, which is the field value, which is going to be Wonder Woman. So all I'm doing is adding a new item for the movie Wonder Woman. Let's go ahead and save and test this. Cool, so it ran successfully. So let's open up the request and see what comes back in this successful action. We see that we get back the method. Yep, that was post. The URI is what we expected. And then this is the body that we passed back. And the outputs are going to be very familiar to us now that we took a look at what we had from the get items. We have a new ID. It's going to be the number 7. And then in here, the title Wonder Woman. We also have our regular modified and created sort of internal fields that come with a SharePoint item. And this is going to be the date and time that I created the item, as well as the author ID and the editor ID. So this is who created it and who modified it. And this is me. This is my ID inside the system. So let's take a look, and here we don't even have to refresh this. This is just automatically updating that we have our new item, Wonder Woman. Let's head back over to the slides and talk about updating this item. Okay, so now that we've created an item, we're going to need to learn how to update the metadata that is part of it. And there's some things about this that are a little tricky. There's a lot going on the screen. Let's try to break it down a little bit here. What we have is some JSON, and in here we're defining two different things. The first is the type of list that we are referring to, and this is going to be specific to the list that we are working with. So in this case, I have type. This is in single quotes. And for this example, this is not the movies list, but this is a flow testing list item that we were working with. So this is the list. The list was called flow testing list item. And the thing that is standard about this is that we have the sp.data in front of it. So for our example, when we're working with movies, this is actually going to be sp.data.movies. And this type of thing doesn't change. All it is the name of the list or library. That's the thing that changes. To access this, to understand what it actually is, if you have a very long name in your list or a list that has characters in it or spaces in it, this is actually something that you can get back just doing a get lists against your lists and then looking for the data that comes back inside of Power Automate. So the second half of this is the metadata that we're passing in. And in this example, we were passing in the color yellow. But for us, we're going to be updating the genre to action. So we've been working previously with a horror movie or a fantasy movie, and now we're going to be updating the genre of the Wonder Woman movie list item to action. So remember, we have a standard format with the list item type definition, the thing that tells me what list it is I'm working against. And then we have a second section for the metadata that we are updating in that particular list. Now, all of this might seem a little confusing, but inside of Power Automate, we don't actually have to get this metadata type definition, this list item type definition. This is something that you would be familiar with if you had been working inside of SharePoint as a developer previously. And this is also something that you're going to need to work with if you are bringing back that OData equals verbose instead of OData equals no metadata inside the headers of your HTTP request. Now, they make it easier for you if you do no metadata. We can just update these key value pairs pretty simply. But this is something that I want you to know exists, number one, in case you run into it, and number two, where to find it inside of Power Automate. So let's go over to Power Automate, take a peek at how to get our list item type definition, but then also look at how to simply structure a patch request just with that metadata. So here we are inside of Power Automate. We're still looking at our post flow here. And what I'd like to do now is just do a get against the list so that I can see that list type definition come back. So let's switch this back to get. And I'm going to blow away what's here in the body. I'm going to click on save. And then let's go ahead and test it. Okay, and let's open up this and see that that's not coming back, right? We don't have our list type definition. All of this is going to be all the internal fields that are there. So let's edit this and instead change our OData equals no metadata to verbose. And if you're familiar with seeing this as a SharePoint developer, as I said, this is what you're going to see coming back. Let's go ahead and test that. So verbose means that more information is coming back, right? With the no metadata, we're not getting a ton of metadata about the list itself, but verbose means send me everything. I want to see it all. And there might be cases where you need that. Generally for performance, you're actually not going to need that, but to show you where it is, that's all coming out through here. So here we are, and we see that there's a lot more going on inside the body, the response body, than previously. It's not just the values that are coming back, but we have here this sort of nested results. I see things about the list here that I might not have necessarily seen before, such as role assignments and things like that. I've got my GUID for the list. I see the different endpoints that I can work with inside the list. And this is definitely advanced things. But this is where you're going to find them, is changing this from verbose, changing this from no metadata to verbose. This is where you're going to get this. So let's go ahead and pull the body out and put it into a notepad next to us so that we can see what's coming back and then find that specific SharePoint type. Okay, let's paste that in. And then what we can see here is we're going to be looking for our sp.data. So I'm going all the way to the top. Let's go ahead and do a Control F and do our sp.data, find next. And here it is, we can see that what's coming back in the different items is what has changed and what type has changed. And these are things that are going to be important when we're working with patch and we're actually working with this in a more robust manner. So what we have here is we have e-tag, and this is the change tag, and we also have the type, and this is sp.data, which is what we looked for because we knew that was a standard thing that was going to show up in front. And then this is movies list item. So whereas we had a flow testing list, it was flow testing list item, now this is movies list item. So this is simply showing the SharePoint data type of what we're working with when we're changing it. And then the e-tag is referencing how this has been changed. And this is also something that you can work with either by specifying the e-tag or by doing a star to catch all e-tags. So again, kind of confusing if we're going through the first part, but bear with me here. There's an easier way to do this. But if you do need to work with more data, this is where you're finding it. Do a get, bring everything back, do your OData as verbose, and you'll see everything that you might need to work with right inside the results. All right, so let's get rid of that. Go ahead and edit this. And then we're going to do our patch. We're going to do this quite simply. So for my patch, what changes here is I want to specify the ID of the item that I'd like to update. So I've changed my method to patch. I have my URI here, and I need to insert into these parentheses what ID number I'm referencing. So I want to change Wonder Woman, and that is ID 7. So it's the SharePoint list ID of what that is inside of the list. So I'm going to go ahead and put 7 here next to items. And then I'm also going to change this back to no metadata. And then I'm going to write in if match, and then a star. And the star is going to catch everything. So I don't actually need to know the value of the e-tag that's coming back. I'm just going to go ahead and do a catch-all. This is going to be the simplest way that we're going to perform a patch here. I also know from looking at the get results when we were looking through and getting the items previously that what I want to work with is the genre, but because genre is a lookup to another list inside of SharePoint, I'm actually working with the ID of the item in the genre list and not specifically the value. So what I need to know is what is the ID of the value action inside of the genre list. So let's go ahead and look inside of SharePoint. Let's go to our genres list, and in here I have fantasy, action, and horror. And I know that I would like to add action, so that's ID number 2. And if I go here and then write in genre ID, let's bring this down. It's going to be easier to work with. So genre ID is my key, colon. And then because this is a number, I'm not putting quotations around this. I'm simply going to write 2 because 2 is the ID of action. And that's what's going to be stuck inside of the movies list. It's not actually going to be the word action. What we have created instead is a relationship between the movies and the genre related on an ID. So let's go ahead and save. And we'll test. And it failed, and it failed pretty obviously because it's actually not genre ID with a capital D. This is actually genre ID like this, which really demonstrates how sensitive this is and how important it is to actually get the internal names of things correctly. So we're going to save, and then we're going to test again. And we'll run that. And now we have success, right? So it's important to note how just a little typo could be the thing that is actually causing your error. And it might be that your logic is fine, right? So let's open this up. And we see, like I mentioned before, that your outputs could show up in a link and you just click to download. So I'm going to open that up, and it's spitting all this back at me, right? Because there's just a whole bunch of information. But this is where all of that body is for that successful patch. Let's take a look here at the movies list and see what's been updated. And there's Wonder Woman that's been updated with the genre action. Now, just if you're not familiar with SharePoint, this is how you can tell that this is actually linking to something else, because what I'm storing inside the list is my number 2 to represent action. But what is showing is the word action, that actual value from the genres list. If I click on this, that's actually going to pop me over to the item genres and any other information that was about it. So great way to sort of relate the information between 2 different lists and kind of create a pseudo relation between 2 different tables, if that's something that you're looking for. Okay, cool. So we've done patch now, and it was a little confusing, right? We had a lot of different concepts to talk about, but at the end of the day, if you're just simply looking to update an item, there's a very straightforward, no metadata way to do this. If you're actually looking to do more with patch, I showed you where to get that. We did a GET request. We looked at all the information that was coming back. We made sure our OData was verbose, so we brought all of that back. But again, if we're just doing this straightforward and simple, this is all you need to do to get started. So the last thing we need to talk about is delete. And delete is extremely straightforward. All delete really requires is the item that you would like to get rid of and the if match header. So what we can do here is change our method to delete, and then we can go ahead and delete the Wonder Woman item. We can leave this as items 7 because that's what we're referring to. And then we can just click this X here to get rid of these headers. And then we can also get rid of the body. So all of this is getting cleaned up. Super, super simple. We're just deleting a particular item, so it takes an ID. We're just making sure that the E tag matches here, and for simplicity purposes, we're using a star to just catch all, right? So we don't actually need to know what the E tag is. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And then we're going to go test it. Okay, it's run successfully. So what I'm expecting is to see a deleted item, right? So this is just that the request here has been successfully completed. And then in here, we no longer have our Wonder Woman item. So since that item had taken up the ID 7, if I recreated the Wonder Woman item again, that's actually going to show up as ID 8. So that's in case I wanted to go ahead and restore the item. It's never going to be the same. So this is why we want to be really careful when we're batch updating things, and if there's a delete action thrown in there, if that's a request that you're actually making, because you're going to have to restore an item if somebody accidentally deletes it. So that's going to be an administrative thing that's going to need to happen inside the site. And you also don't want to accidentally begin looping through things and deleting. So I like to be very specific and very purposeful when I'm using delete. Otherwise, I really don't include it inside of scheduled or maintenance flows. Okay, so I have some bonus items here for you. I want to take a look at some of these different ways of working with items inside of a SharePoint list, things that you can do. Some of them you can do inside of the actual out-of-the-box actions. They've been added and can be used now just pretty simply. But if you're still looking to work with HTTP, there's a few things that you can do and stuff that I know I've had to look up. So we have, for instance, checking for unique permissions on an item. We still have this very similar pattern of our items inside our list, but it's a / has unique role assignments. This is something that we're using to see whether or not we actually have item level permissions within a list. So this is going to be very useful if you have a flow that has to update different list items with different permissions, which I don't ever recommend that you but if you actually have to do that, sometimes there's no way around it. This is what you're looking for to check. Does it have unique role assignments? If you then have to break permission inheritance on an item in order to do these unique role assignments, this is grabbing an item, looking in the ID. See, I have my ID there defined as 1, and then break role inheritance is what we're looking at. So we can also copy role assignments. We can bring those over from something else, but in this case, we're just saying false. Just break our inheritance. You can also re-inherit in a similar manner, but if you had to break role inheritance, this is how you have to do that. This is giving you item level permissions. I also use HTTP actions to work with content types and document sets in a library quite often. So kind of getting you started down that rabbit hole, there are ways to work with content types inside of the out-of-the-box actions in Power Automate, but I typically just go the HTTP route because I have a ton more control. So again, sending you down that rabbit hole. If you want to look at all of the content types inside of a library and then do something with them, you can get your documents library by title, and it's the same structure working with a library as with a list. It's still /lists / get by title, and then the name of the library. And then it's simply content types with a question mark. This is going to list out all your content types, and then you can know what is a part of what. If you want to retrieve a specific content type in a library, given the name, then you can go ahead and use content types and then start working with filters. So this is a concept that we haven't gone over today, and this would be something that's for a little bit more of an advanced section. But what you do in order to add a filter, or in order to add an expand or select to a request in a URI, we're actually using that question mark, and then we're using a $sign. So I have my question mark, $sign filter, and then I'm filtering on the name of the content type I'm looking for, which in this case is project. So these are some bonus ways to get you kind of down like I said, the rabbit hole of working with HTTP against SharePoint. All you're doing is using very familiar patterns inside of Power Automate and building up that URI and building up that body as you need to work with things here. Okay, thank you so much for your time. I know this is a fire hose of an introduction into using HTTP, but there's so much here, and if you can master the simple art of using get, post, patch, and delete, there's a whole world there that you can actually dive into. So much control that you have over your SharePoint data. So thank you so much for having me. I really hope you've enjoyed the summit so far and enjoy the rest of your sessions. Thank you.